Good morning. We're going to start promptly because we will have to end promptly. And my name's Jean Hodges. You are in the UMC West Ballroom, in case any of you are confused. And the title of our talk at this time is Men, Women, and SpongeBob: Discrimination versus Innate Differences. Our four panelists I will briefly introduce to you, although you do have their bios in your program, but I'll just lift up some just because it kind of gives you a context for our conversation. And I will give them in the order in which they're going to speak. Leonard Shlain is an author. I think of him as a Renaissance man, though I don't use that term very often. Certainly a visionary, and if I just tell you the names of the books he's written, you'll get some sense of that. He is an associate professor of surgery at the University of California at San Francisco, and the books that he's written I just think are really interesting. Art and Physics, Parallel Visions in Space, Time, and Light was published in 1991. His second book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, The Conflict Between Word and Image, became a national bestseller. And his new book is called Sex, Time, and Power: How Women's Sexuality Shaped Human Evolution. And that too will rise to be a bestseller, I'm sure, if it's not already. Scott Fried, on my left, I should say Leonard is on my immediate left, and left of him is Scott Fried, who is a motivational speaker who's devoted the past 13 years to talking with teens and their parents. Since getting infected with HIV in 1987, he's lectured in nearly every state in the country, as well as Israel, England, Canada, reaching over 1 million teens. He has also written about AIDS in particular, the faces of AIDS, living at the epicenter. He is the author of a book called If I Grow Up, talking with teens about AIDS, love, and staying alive. And his second book, My Invisible Kingdom, Letters from the Secret Lives of Teens, was just recently released. And this publishes the letters of teens who have written to Fried, sharing their pain and doubt on such diverse topics as rape, eating disorders, suicide, self-mutilation, coming out, addiction, and broken hearts. Bill Clifford, to my right, is an associate director of the MIT Sloan Fellows Program in Innovation and Global Leadership. This is a new position for him because before that he was a house husband, which I think is relevant to our conversation this morning. From 1991 to 2002, he was a financial journalist based in Japan. He launched and managed news bureaus in Tokyo and Hong Kong for CBS MarketWatch, and prior to that, he directed the Tokyo Bureau for CNBC Asia. He likes to share his interest in Asia and personal investing with grade school students as a volunteer teacher in Boston's Citizens Schools program. He's a graduate of Tufts University and has a master's from Johns Hopkins in Advanced International Studies, and that's enough credits. Jessica Seigel is very eclectic in her own right. She covers consumer culture, body politics, and lifestyle as the so-called Countess of Culture for National Public Radio's Day to Day program. She's contributed to many publications, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Salon, Village Voice, and the Washington Post. You should read her bio. It's very interesting, but I'll just lift up that she consults and edits for magazines all over. She's an adjunct journalism professor at New York University, and along with swing and salsa dancing, Jessica Seigel is an auxiliary mounted parks officer who patrols New York City parks on horseback. So our topic is very broad, as it is meant to be. So we'll see. What we will try to do is that each person will have between 5 and 10 minutes to speak. I'm saying 5 so that they won't go over 10. And I will try to keep track of time well enough so that we have plenty of time for questions and answers, because that's the interesting part. And I should also tell you we will need to quit at 10 minutes before our 10:30 time to give you time to move to your next panel. So without any further introduction, then, let me begin with Leonard Shlain.
Thank you. It's great to be back in Boulder again. I was feeling very sorry for Larry Summers because he forgot to add a semicolon. What he said, I believe, is true. He said there are innate differences between men and women, and there are some things that men do better than women. What he forgot to add was a semicolon, and then he should have added, and there are some things that women do better than men. And because he didn't add the second part of the sentence, he got himself in a whole lot of trouble. Now, I think that the whole nature-nurture debate is a sterile debate, because that's what this is really all about. There is no gene-controlled trait that cannot be modified by the environment, and there is no environmental factor that cannot be overridden by some genetic trait to some degree. So within the context of those two things, nature and nurture play a role, and more so in humans than any other animal, because imagine that you were an intergalactic visitor and you were visiting a zoo, and in the zoo were all these different animals. As you went from cage to cage or enclosure to enclosure, you would have a hard time telling the males from the females, except for their markings, by what they did in the course of a day. And until you came to the human enclosure, the division of labor between human, male and female, is greater than it is between the division of labor of any other species. And this is due to the fact that human females deliver their young at 9 months. According to primate studies, it's been estimated that the human female primate should deliver a baby at 18 months. But she can't deliver at 18 months because if she goes even a week over 9 months, she endangers her own life and the baby's life of dying in childbirth. So as a result, we deliver our babies extraordinarily immature, and as any mother and father knows, these are helpless babies that require an enormous amount of time and energy to get them to the point that they can survive on their own. At the same time, there are 270 species of primates, and 269 of them are primarily vegetarians. Chimps and baboons eat a little bit of meat, but for all practical purposes, shoots, roots, nuts, and fruits are what they eat. Humans are predators, and we are social predators. We hunt in groups. And interestingly enough, in all the other social predators like hyenas and lion prides and orcapods and wolf packs, the females play a leading role in the hunting and the killing, except in humans. The hunting party consists primarily of males, and you have this extraordinary division of labor, which then plays itself off from an evolutionary point of view in producing innate differences in men and women. And I'd like to begin by pointing out that I think that the Lacanian, Derridian, post-constructionist, postmodern, that everything is culturally determined is, I'd like to refute that. I think that there's too much evidence now from an evolutionary point of view that this is not all cultural, the gender is not simply culturally determined. We now know, for example, that every fetus is born a female. Contrary to the Adam and Eve story, it's the reverse. Every fetus is a female fetus unless it is acted upon by testosterone at 6 weeks. And if it has a Y chromosome, and the Y chromosome causes that little baby's testes to put out prodigious amounts of testosterone that then will shape that fetus into a male and have a male brain as opposed to a female brain. Now, there are differences between the male and the female brain that have come to light in the last few years, primarily the fact that the most specialized brain belongs to a right-handed heterosexual male. Gays and lesbians, women, and left-handed men and women do not have that same setup. They have a much more balanced brain in terms of where language centers are located as opposed to the language centers being located primarily all in the left hemisphere of the right-handed heterosexual male. It's also been shown that the corpus callosum, the connecting fibers between the right and left hemispheres of the human brain, are larger in females than they are in males. Now, this work was done by a woman, by the way, Sandra Whittleson. So, and much of the work that I'm going to discuss has been done by women scientists, so which gives credence to the fact that I don't want to make it sound like the men are discriminating. Doreen Camara did a very extensive study on the cognitive differences between men and women. And she found that there are many things that men do that are better than what women can do. Primarily, for example, on SAT scores, the highest scores formed consistently are by left-handed males. And the skewing is so far off the standard deviation scale that you have to conclude that this is not something that's culturally determined. Men can throw more accurately at a target than women can, and men can find their way back in directions better than women can. At the same token, women can multitask much better than men can. They can do fine motor movements much better than men can, which is probably the reason why all those rugs that we buy from the Middle East are made by 9-year-old girls that are doing that fine sewing. And also, women have a better capacity to take in more in a glance than a man does. Many's the party that I've been to with my wife that after we've left, she said, "Did you notice, did you catch, did you," I was totally oblivious to what had gone on. This also applies to our eyes, because it turns out that you have two different ways of seeing. You have rods and cones. And your rods fill up your retina and give you the big picture. And your cones occupy less than 1% of the square area of your retina, but give to your vision extraordinary clarity and focusing ability. Well, it turns out that men have much better cone vision and 20/20 vision and distance viewing than women do. And women can see better in the dark and see more in a glance and see better in the periphery than men can. And when we examine their eyes, we find that women have more rods in their eyes than men do, and men have more cones in their eyes than women do. From a developmental point of view, there are many different innate differences between boys and girls. For example, the developmental anomalies that occur, such as dyslexia, autism, Asperger's syndrome, which is a mild form of autism, schizophrenia, are much more common in boys than they are in girls. And all of those developmental problems relate to social interactions. Girls are much more verbal than boys are. They learn to speak correct grammar at a much earlier age than boys do. And the diseases that men and women have are different. Women are more prone to develop autoimmune diseases. Men are more prone to develop heart attacks and strokes. And women outlive men by an average of about 5 years in the United States right now. When it comes to sexuality, there are innate differences, as we all know. The libido of a young boy, the thermostat is turned on full blast the minute he reaches puberty, and it wanes consistently over time. The libido of a woman doesn't reach its peak until her late 30s, early 40s, about the same time that a man has discovered that he has a favorite chair. Who set this system up? I've concluded that they're so out of phase with each other that probably the only time they'll ever be on the same page is when they get to the nursing home and they're both interested in having a good bowel movement. As far as in the last, the thing on SpongeBob, which is on the title of this, for those of you who are wondering why SpongeBob was added to this, there was this recent brouhaha about one of the Christian right claiming that a video made showing SpongeBob holding hands with one of his male partners to teach tolerance to little elementary school kids was basically advancing a homosexual agenda. So they attacked SpongeBob and again, the whole homosexual aspect of our society. Now, it turns out that there is no other species that has as florid expression of homosexuality as humans. Biologists have identified about 200 different species that they believe are manifesting some degree of homosexual behavior. But in most of those cases, it's dominance displays where a male baboon will mount another male baboon, and it's a sexual gesture, but it's really about dominance. And I personally believe, that we have lived in the hominid existence for 2.5 million years. And it's only been in the last 8,000 that we became agriculturalists, and then in the last few hundred years that we've settled in industrial societies. Our nervous systems are wired to help us survive as hunter-gatherers. And it turns out that I believe that homosexuality is a genetic predisposition that has passed along from generation to generation. The numbers are varied. There's been a recent study out of Chicago that's been much quoted, saying that only, that less than 1% of the population are gay. But try telling that to the gay and lesbian population, and they will dispute that. Certainly, you couldn't tell that to Athenian Athens, and you couldn't tell that to Renaissance Florence, where there certainly was a much higher thing. Now, I believe that gays and lesbians add a tremendous value to the society at large. Leslie Aiello and Dunbar figured out that the optimal size for a hunter-gatherer group ranges between 150 to 225 people. Anything larger than that or smaller than that is not economically feasible. And if you think about it, if you have a wedding, that's about the size of the number of people that you would invite to a wedding, so that template still holds today. And the hunting group, the central core hunting group of this hunter-gatherer tribe was about 12 men in their prime. And that still holds today because a squad in the Army is 10 men, a football team is 11, there's 12 on a jury, there's 12 apostles, there's 12 Greek gods. So 9 to 12 seems to be the number that it takes to get a cooperative group of adults in their prime to carry out a complex project. If one of those 12 were gay, and they went on a hunting trip and they killed a large animal, and he didn't have a family to feed back at home, there would be 8% more meat to distribute to the women and children back at the home base. And in general, the statistics that I tend to accept is that from Masters and Johnson and the older statistics from Kinsey, that generally speaking, in the population, depending upon how repressive it is, gays and lesbians, gay men vary between 8 and 13%, and lesbian women are lower than that, between 5 and 7%. If one woman out of 20 doesn't have children of her own to take care of, she can help the other mothers with their children. And in a hunter-gatherer tribe, this is a great benefit if you are a child and you have an aunt or an uncle who does not have children of their own. It's been well described that brothers take better care of their sisters' children in hunter-gatherers tribes because that's the way the bloodlines run. So I would conclude my remarks by simply saying that I think that that what Summers said is absolutely true. There are innate differences between men and women. I have 2 daughters and a son, and I now have 6 grandchildren. And I'm basically a scientist who has been observing them, and there's people that say, if you dress the little boys in pink and the little girls in blue, it's going to make a difference. Trust me. I mean, you give the trucks to the boys, dolls to the boys, they'll make them into trucks. You give the trucks to the girls, they'll make them into dolls. With that, I conclude.
Thank you. I'm Scott Freed, and I'm so impressed with the amount of people that are in this room. Thank you for coming here this morning. My focus when I talk around the country is based on my work with teenagers. So my 9.5 minutes will be based on my work with teenagers and as it relates to, I suppose, innate differences between men and women or girls and boys. I wanted to just add one point to what I just heard, which was that in the hunter-gatherer world that we live in today, there are homosexual men and women that have children of their own, and that therefore fulfill a different prophecy, I think. So what I want to say is that, starting off with, when I was a little kid, I remember being in a gym class and not being picked for the side, or being the last person picked to even the sides, which a lot of boys, if you're short, have experienced when they're kids and even when they're older. And I remember once when they said, we need a guy, we need a boy to be on this side of the dodgeball game. David Levenstein, when somebody pointed to me, David Levenstein said, that's a boy? And it destroyed me because I was a boy, and in my family at home I was called the boys. I'm twin brothers, so we were the boys as opposed to the sister, and also because I was in love, secretly, desperately in love with David Levenstein. So for David to call me anything but a boy meant that he didn't see who I was becoming. Meant that maybe I wasn't becoming who I was becoming, or I wanted to become. When I was a little older, David and his friends called me words like faggot, and loser, and freak, and geek, and pussy, limp wrist, and pansy, and wuss, and chump, but mostly fag. And nowadays, boys and girls use different words to describe each other because those words are not politically correct. So nowadays, they use the expression, that's so gay, to describe anything that is innately different from them. Then you've got androgynous Pat. Is she a woman? Is she a man? Then you've got SpongeBob. Is he a boy? Is he a girl? He's square. He wears underwear in front of his boy friends. He has a high-pitched voice. And he's a target. That's a boy and that's a girl. That's a child. I teach all over the country. Just the other day, on Saturday, a group of boys were working with me and separate from the girls, and the boys said to me, tell me this. We were talking about sex and masturbation and HIV and herpes and loneliness, and they said, tell me this, why do the girls always have to cry? And I said, you tell me this. Why do you not share your tears like the girls do? I don't know that the differences are all that huge when you're given a chance to really disclose them. What I've discovered is in my travels, when I break the girls and the guys up in separates, that girls love to jerk off just as much as guys, or at least talking about it, but they don't, with each other, but they don't talk about it to their guy friends. Or if they don't, they certainly want the world to know that they're not as prissy or prim and proper as people suspect they are. They also want me to teach that there are girls who are as promiscuous as the boys that say they are when it comes to sex. But the way the world sees teenage girls and teenage boys is a little different. In University of Michigan, a few years ago, there's a t-shirt put out by one of the fraternities. They made a t-shirt out of a sign that said, here, it's the Michigan Daily, University of Michigan, it said, freshman girls, get them while they're skinny. And it's funny to some, but it's tragic if you're a freshman girl. And that's how some guys like to see girls. Girls see themselves as supporting each other until they're competing against each other. And the very same ones who will hold each other's tears, catch each other's tears, and cry to each other will be the same ones that break each other down in competition. Guys don't see, the ones I see, don't seem to compete with as much bitterness, is what it seems to me. In terms of self-destruction or outward destruction, when life is reckless with a teenager, they get reckless with their lives. And what the differences I've noticed, this is my own experience around the country with thousands and thousands of teenagers, is that with girls, it seems to be they take it out on themselves more than the guys who will take it out on each other or other people. And it's not really fair to be general or characteristic, but if I have to, I'd say that a teenage girl will take her pain about her parents' divorce, or about her weight issues, or about not willing to take her clothes off in front of a boyfriend, or immediately put them back on once they're done having sex. And the definition of sex to a girl is a lot different than the definition of sex to a guy. With the recklessness of their lives and the pain in their hearts, they will take their fingers and throw up their dinner, down their throats and throw up their dinner. Or they will take a razor blade and cut their skin to feel the pain, to get out of the pain, to get past the pain, because physical pain has a beginning and an end, but emotional pain keeps going on and on. And with guys, generally speaking, some have eating disorders, some will take a match to their skin, but most, more times than not, will hurt others, will become the bullies, will become members of gangs. Certainly there are girls that are parts of gangs, but the guys are the ones who take a handgun from their stepfather's gun closet and go to school with it. Every shooting you've ever seen, from Columbine to Paducah, Kentucky, to Red Lake, 2 weeks ago, to Conyers, Georgia, to wherever you see, involves most of the time, in fact, what I've seen all the time, a boy taking that handgun. The reasons they self-destruct are the same. The ways in which it manifests may be different. But to me, the energy of taking 2 fingers down your throat to throw up your mother's dinner is the same intention and energy that it takes to take a handgun and point it at somebody else. It's just a different direction. Why is that? Why is it that a teenage girl will say, the world has been reckless with me, therefore I have to hurt myself? And a boy will sometimes say, life sucks, so I'm going to make yours hurt just like it feels like for me. I can't say. Maybe it's the ways in which we expect teenagers to grow and to become. I know that for myself, growing up as someone who was so gay, in the actual definition of what gay is, homosexual, men loving other men, and being told that gay means unathletic, can't throw a baseball, can't cry, shouldn't cry out loud, and to me that meant that somehow I have to fulfill a role I could never fulfill. I internalized my shame. I used a weapon against myself instead of somebody else. For me, it was unsafe sex and getting infected with HIV, but the person that infected me used his HIV as a weapon against me. I used it against myself, and he used it against me to outwardly say, I don't want to be this in the world. I don't want to become the person I'm becoming and who the people think I'm supposed to be, so I'm going to have to destroy you and take you down because I'm going down as well. I think men, women, and SpongeBob, see, I think what it's saying is if we have to behave a certain way in the world, then, and if we're picked on because of the way that we are, the people we're becoming and the way we act and dress, then the world will see us a certain way and make fun of us for being who we're becoming, and ultimately the worst case scenario, we hurt ourselves or each other and we don't live an authentic life. Every single one of us lives inside of a closet, whether it's a gay closet or a straight closet, the my mother has breast cancer closet, the I cut my skin because I hate my thighs closet, the I'm so invisible closet. And when the world tells us we have to be a certain way, we have to fulfill that role, we are forced deeper and deeper into the closet, and it's pretty damn crowded in there. I call it a kingdom, not a closet. And I think that ultimately, if there are innate differences, my goal is to be able to celebrate those differences and perhaps maybe celebrate the things that are so similar about girls and boys. Thanks.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. Ooh, this is hard for me. I was in a car accident recently. Thank you, my co-panelists, for introducing this in precisely this way. Forcing people into the closet and picking on people and forgetting semicolons. I think Larry Summers was trying to be provocative, and one of the things he provoked in the New York Times, March 20th, was a full-page ad headlined, "Women Can't Do Science." And here are 53 American colleges and universities signing up to say for 170 years we've been producing graduates and scientists who are quite capable. And to the extent that Larry Summers did any good for the wider world, and he certainly did some good for my end of Massachusetts Avenue at MIT, he has lit a fire, and it comes at a time when the United States is not attracting enough boys and girls into the sciences and engineering, and we need to graduate these people to remain competitive in the global economy. So in one sense, Larry Summers has done us all a favor. What he was trying to provoke, though, was research of a very specific kind into the statistical and scientific differences that separate the sexes. This wasn't really his only point at the conference in January. He also listed two other factors, and in the order of relevance in his mind, they were that the reasons that he hypothesized women are not as well represented in university faculties in sciences and engineering, as you may know, are that there is the work-life balance, the commitment that men have typically wanted and been able to make for 80-hour weeks of research in the lab and so on. Women just aren't up to the task because they're producing children, and at some point in their careers they're cut off and they lose out of the full flowering of a male career. Secondly, he argued that perhaps this has something to do with innate cognitive differences. And, as Leonard said, there may be something to that. I would say that they're probably so slight that we best not prejudge them. And his third reason was that discrimination and socialization has resulted in the relatively underpopulated female faculties. His support of that view had to do with an economist's view that in a free market, it will clear. There is a university, Rutgers, which is now looking for all the women it can hire in sciences, and yet it can't fill these positions. The market isn't clearing. That has to do with the pool, that has to do with the stickiness of people in these jobs, that has to do with the nature of tenure, which is, by definition, not a free market. It is a protected world we live in academia. So I think he could have reversed his order, and the research that is out there, that he not only forgot the semicolon, but he forgot that, or he was just ignorant of a tremendous volume of research, especially over the last 10 years, and I might say much of it done, or a good portion of it done at MIT, shows the patterns that have kept women from gaining the highest positions in universities in science and engineering. That's probably the top reason. You could say, certainly, that, and I hope we will discuss the work-life balance issue as a reason why women are selecting or not selecting certain roles. And finally, whatever the innate differences are, I would say Larry Summers has probably closed off some of the impetus to research there, because now there is a political backlash, political correctness backlash that he engendered, and it will take some brave souls to say, we should ask this question. What are the differences? And I happen to think that, you know, the assumption coming from the white male president and very distinguished Larry Summers is that he's authoritative and we believe it, when in fact, let's do that research. We may find that women are far better equipped in the sciences and engineering than men. We really don't know. But what we do know, and what I'd like to talk about, is the experience of women at MIT. I've had the privilege of hearing from Nancy Hopkins, biologist at the Institute for 30 years, twice in the last couple of months. She's become quite active on the speaking circuit again, because she is the woman who walked out of the room at the National Bureau of Economic Research that Summers made his famous remarks at. And what Nancy describes at MIT is a shift. First in the mid-60s when she joined, and the feeling that civil rights legislation had created all kinds of opportunities for women, and that they started out equally to men in the science faculty. But as time went on, there was this feeling that for her, and she wasn't aware of it in other female colleagues, that there were more subtle forms of discrimination, but The initial reaction, the psychological reaction, is to deny that there's a problem because civil rights legislation has corrected it. And the second reaction is that, well, it's my circumstances or choices to live this way, to have children, to pursue this line of research and not that line of research. Am I being aggressive enough? Am I promoting myself enough? Am I not working hard enough? There's a lot of self-doubt. And the fact that there are so few women at this time, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, there's really no sample where you can compare, is it just me? Or is this a more universal thing? But in the mid-90s, 1994, Nancy Hopkins and about 8, there were only 15 tenured women on the MIT faculty in 1994 compared to 197 men. They began to compile data. And what they found was salaries, pensions, lab space, other resources, awards, grants, the ability to go outside the university and get counteroffers and come back and say, hey, they're willing to pay me this, you need to upgrade me, which is one thing that has been a very great privilege for men, by the way, the ease in which they could transfer should they want to. And they compiled this data, they presented it to the dean, they studied it further, and then they studied it for 5 years. And finally, Charles Vest, president of MIT, publicized it and said that up till now it's been his impression that gender discrimination at universities, part reality, part perception, but what he concluded is by far the large part was reality. And this made the front page of Boston Globe, just as it is now, front page of the New York Times, and MIT admits to gender bias. Immediately, MIT began hiring and promoting women such that the sciences faculty went from about 8% to 11%. It's now 17%. We now have our first woman president, Susan Hockfield of the Institute. We have 5 female vice presidents. There are all kinds of councils to monitor gender issues and to make sure equity in salary and all the things I mentioned are happening. This has been going on for 5 years, and at the other end of the avenue, in Harvard Square, I guess there's someone who lives in a pineapple and blows bubbles occasionally and isn't aware of what the research has been done. The psychology is amazing. There have been studies where a man and a woman of the same height standing next to a tree are perceived by others, and the conclusion is that the male is taller. There were blind studies and blind auditions in the 1970s for orchestras when women were underrepresented in symphonies, and it was found that suddenly, when behind the screen someone was playing a violin or a cello, it happened to be a woman, and all of a sudden that corrected itself, or began to. There are studies that show, again blind, that same paper, same exact topic, if it's written by a man and a woman, it would be perceived as equal. However, if we know that the author's a man, and we know the author is a woman, the assumption is it might just be more authoritative coming from the guy. And a Swedish group of scientists found that in the publication Nature, a woman would have to publish 2 to 3 papers more than a male counterpart to gain the certain reputation and respect of colleagues to be promoted and so on. So this is nothing to do with innate differences. This is all about society and preferences that have been building up over the decades and centuries. I think that, unfortunately for Harvard now, where coincidentally, under Larry Summers' reign, they've had a lot of difficulty. I think there were 32 faculty openings and only 4 were filled by women. They have been having a tremendous time trying to hire women. And now Larry Summers has in effect prompted a backlash that means there will be an informal affirmative action type of process happening at Harvard because the Boston Globe is going to review every year what kind of progress is being made. And what woman is going to trade for the prestige of being on the Harvard faculty when, judged by her peers and especially other women, are going to say, did you get this because you're a blazing mathematician or scientist? And so, luckily for those of us at MIT and other colleges, we might be seeing some of those applications coming our way. But it is amazing that even in the progress that has been made for women at MIT, and right now there's a great movement essentially replicating the studies and the policies. It's happening now for minorities, where we're hoping to double faculty at undergraduate and triple it in the graduate schools to reflect the student body representation of minorities. We're seeing this effect. But at MIT, even at the rate that it's increased from 10 or 11% in 1999 to say 17 or 18% of the faculty being women today, it will take something like 40 years to get to 40%. Because, again, people just don't leave that university when they've got a lock on their job. The policies can be in place. The mindset can be in place, but it's going to take a very long time. And I close my remarks by saying it's not to say that we need 50%. Maybe, based on the numbers that flow, we get more women than men sometimes. There's no desired target. What has to happen, of course, is there has to be the equal opportunity and chance. And what happens is there is some self-selection. With numbers so low over these years, girls, in particular, girls don't have the role models from top-level female scientists and engineers to encourage them. And that's what I think is going to be the next step. As we fill those faculty slots on the basis of merit, we will begin to develop more and more. There are tremendous programs in high schools around the country. There are awards from corporations like Intel and Westinghouse and Siemens. More and more we will draw women, but I think I saw numbers in Business Week recently where perhaps 47 to 50-something% of undergraduate science degrees are taken by women. About 20% in engineering are taken by women. But in the working world, it's about 10 to 1 male engineers to female. And that is an imbalance that, again, for this country to compete globally, we need to encourage all the scientists and engineers we can. And there's no stopping the brain power.
Hey, everybody. I had a revelation while I was sitting here thinking about my own background. I had never thought of this before my experience at Stuyvesant High School in New York City. Stuyvesant High School is one of the few high schools in the country devoted solely to science and math. You have to take a test to get in. And I just realized that I always accepted as natural that girls did as well as boys at Stuyvesant. You would think from the argument that testosterone affects intelligence, that suddenly when puberty kicks in high school, that women would not be as intelligent as men, that they would not be scoring as well on the math and science tests. In my experience, and the national tests prove this, that wasn't the case at all, and we had the National Merit Scholars, and all of those things that you saw at Stuyvesant. We have some of the top astronomers in the country who have come out of the school, creating a very positive environment. we were taught as girls, even if we didn't go into the sciences, which I did not, I went on to study intellectual history at Wesleyan, to understand science, to excel in science, and to not be afraid of it. So what I would like to do right now is to present to you some gender analytics, some tools for thinking about this nature-nurture argument now that it has come up again. It was not anything discussed when I was in high school. It had not come up. It has resurrected itself at this moment, at a very particular moment in time in our history, when feminists are saying that we are really, truly at the peak, but one doesn't know where it's going to go, of a backlash against women's advancement. So I just want to talk to you from an intellectual history perspective. How can we think about this? One of the first things that I think we need to look at is how is this argument of innate difference being used? Throughout the history of science, it has actually been used to justify subjugation of women, to justify inequity. It's hard for us to see how we're using it today because we're caught right in its grip, and everything seems so scientific. Well, these studies seem so scientific, just as they did at the dawn of science, at the dawn of biology, when scientists believed absolutely that women should not think too hard because it would divert blood from their ovaries, and they needed the blood in their ovaries. That was a major argument for a long time, and it has morphed over the decades, over the century, so in each generation, it somehow seems right. You're like, but these SATs, these studies, it just seems right. The brain imaging, that's science, right? So think about how is the argument being used? And let me just bring that back for a moment to the Enlightenment. Arguments of natural law, in other words, there were natural law, sweeping generalizations, were used at the beginning of the Enlightenment to counter the king's rule. Every time you see a rule from natural law, it's being used with a function. Think about what is that function. Another way to think. Are women in these arguments being described in terms of their bodies, their reproductive system, even their appearance, whereas men, when you talk about them in these arguments, are being referred to in terms of their brains. In other words, their intelligence is described more, their mental activity is described more, and you're hearing about women's ovaries, you're hearing about women's sex organs, are you hearing about men's sex organs? Just think about that. And by the way, if you're interested in that point, Londa Scheinberger, who is the head of the Women's Institute at Stanford University, has done something called a gender analytics that she would like to be applied to all sciences today. And anyone interested in that, I recommend her book greatly, Nature's Body. It's really terrific. Do these sweeping generalizations, particularly from so-called evolutionary theory, and by the way, I am a Darwinian, but are these sweeping generalizations of the ways things are supposed to be being used instead of discussion of variation? Let me tell you that right now the cutting edge in biological sciences in terms of animal behavior and human behavior is on variation. And they are now beginning to see, for example, Joan Silk at UCLA and her baboon studies. One thing that they're seeing is the tremendous variation in success of mothers in raising children. And what are the factors that go into one mother being able to raise a child to survival, and the other mother, the baby dies. There might even be infanticide for various reasons. That is in the natural order. And then how do we apply this to humans? Are all women the same in terms of their abilities to mother, in terms of their intelligence? Are all men the same? What are the variations that you see? This is particularly important, by the way, in terms of public policy, because there are some women who are just equipped to be single mothers. There are some women who psychologically are able to do it also in part because of their social networks. There are many, many variabilities that go into it. And I think you have to think about these when you hear these sweeping generalizations that we're really hunter-gatherers, and the reason men can throw is because it relates to the spear. Is that a just so story, or does it relate to us? In other words, think about it. This one I call my my goose and gander argument. Are these arguments for innate differences being applied equally in terms of what we see in terms of workplace success? We've heard that, well, women aren't as good in math and science, and that's why you don't see them in the sciences as much. This is the one we're constantly hearing. We also hear, oh yes, well, women are good at some things, you know, they're better at some things, but we don't see that applied to the work world. Yes, everyone says women are good at socializing, and they're good at, you know, talking to each other, and they're good at multitasking. This is one I've heard quite a bit. If that were true, why aren't they in charge of the UN? Why aren't women in charge of Harvard? This guy, Larry Summers, seems to, everyone admits, well, he has certain personal issues. He's not so good at creating coalitions, but no one is challenging his right to be president of Harvard in terms of his sex weaknesses. You just don't hear that. Is the male work model being accepted as innate and universal? In other words, anytime you hear a discussion of women's life issues, oh, you know, they just don't want to work 80 hours. That's women's choice. What is being accepted as the standard? There was a time that I think many people in this room may remember, and probably better than I, because I wasn't really quite there. I was very young. So maybe you'll be able to tell us when we start talking. When the idea was that we were going to change the workplace into something that was more suitable to men and women. That hasn't happened. And now it's the way women are being blamed for not reaching the higher levels of Harvard is because they just can't fit this model. So think about that. And in terms of that, when you hear that women just can't cut it in this male world, what is not being discussed? Okay, so what aren't you seeing the media talking about? Well, one thing is childcare. It has been, even the issue, the subject of childcare has been ghettoized as some kind of women's issue. It doesn't relate to men. And you don't see the coverage of this important social issue that you used to. I pulled a study that was comparing childcare in America to childcare in Europe, and I was kind of shocked because I have to say, you know, I'm a patriot. I always thought that, you know, America does things better. Well, it turns out that childcare is nationally subsidized in France, and that every single child, pretty much about 100%, is in daycare that they don't even call daycare because they see it as what we call Head Start, ages 3, 4, and 5. 100%, and they don't see that as that these kids are going to turn out to have some kind of personality problem, which is the argument that has been used in the United States. Now, the French are not a radical feminist people, and if they can have 100% of their young children in childcare that is apparently of very good quality, why don't we have that here? And more importantly, why isn't that issue in the national agenda? Why is it being pushed back on women as they just can't cope? I think Bill did a really great job of addressing this argument on its face. In other words, responding tit for tat in terms of the statistics that we've been seeing. So I don't really have to come back to the advances that MIT has made, but let me just make one little point. If these supposed differences in intelligence, and that's what we're talking about, I mean, we know there are sex differences. I mean, look at me and look at that. But if we get to the issue of intelligence, it is really quite impossible if women are innately not as good at math and science for them to have made the extraordinary strides that we have in the last 30 years in terms of test scores. It's just not possible. The evolutionary forces that have been discussed in this nature-nurture argument are taking place over 1 million years. Now, how are you going to have an evolutionary change in 30 years? Let me just add to some of those. Girls in high school have closed the test gap with boys from 17 points lagging behind boys in 1973 to 8 points behind boys in 2000. And we don't know where that is going. And more girls maybe get the opportunity to go to a high school like I did, Stuyvesant High School, where the idea that I was a girl and couldn't do math, even though my Barbie said math is hard, she did say that, and let's go shopping. I still have that Barbie, but the recorder thing has broken down, and now all she says is da 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 da, which I think works about right. So until these discriminatory things that we see at MIT in other high schools, that many girls in this country suffer under the burden that if you are good at science, you're not feminine, and all of those stereotypes, then we will see. I want to close on a comment about SpongeBob, SquarePants, who is not a cheese, but a sponge, and the argue of homosexuality and heterosexuality. Now, a lot of the material that I've been sharing with you, I learned in a recent profile and story that I did about the Darwinian feminists who have overhauled a lot of the gender bias that came from Darwin's followers, not necessarily Darwin, in terms of the emphasis of sex selection over survival of the fittest in the history of evolutionary theory. And this is in Ms. Magazine on the issue that's just hitting the newsstand. Is a profile of a bonobo researcher named Amy Parrish, who works at the San Diego Zoo and the Wild Animal Life Park there with bonobo, who you may or may not know are a female-dominated primate, one of the great apes. There are 4 great apes, and the chimps and the bonobo are considered genetically to be closest to us. We have been most influenced by the chimp model, which was basically researched and promoted after World War II, a time when people were looking for the worst in human nature and found it in chimp studies, which, by the way, are being overhauled. They were seen to be aggressive, male-dominated, hierarchical, all of these things that were then applied, you know, the book Chimpanzee Politics, then applied immediately to humans. That's how we really are. Well, it turns out that the bonobo, equally genetically related to us, have a completely different model that, if you want to use evolutionary arguments, let's talk about the bonobo. They are female-dominated, and how the females manage to dominate males that are 15% larger than them is through female alliances. Now, what is striking about these female alliances is the females will just gang up on the guy. What's a female alliance? Ganging up, bullying. And I'm not going to whitewash these bonobo. Those females can get pretty savage. But the thing about these alliances that I think we all should think about is that they are not among female relations. They are amongst unrelated females, meaning it is not a blood tie that these alliances work on. One thing that I learned, getting back to SpongeBob, there was a SpongeBob in here. When I was at the zoo and hanging out with Amy and watching these bonobo, and let me tell you, when I saw a bonobo named Lolita chasing around a bonobo guy to try to make him have sex with her, that was the moment of revelation for me, because I have to tell you, I don't think I really believed it. I didn't. Sadie Hawkins seemed kind of, quaint or whatever. The dating books all say to you, if you chase a guy, if you ask a guy out, you're going against the rules of nature. So even if you wanted to do it and then you did it, you would fail, because the man needs to be the hunter and you need to be the gatherer. Okay, so I'm standing there and watching this bonobo female absolutely hound this guy. She's presenting. It's very X-rated, but if anyone wants to know, who doesn't know what that is, I'll tell you later. She reaches out and squeezes his testicles. I mean, I'm like, oh my God, it rocked my world. Not that I've done that. I immediately went home and asked the man out. I'd never done that before. This is what Amy told me. So this is from the front lines of the animal kingdom, from Amy Parrish to you, in terms of the issue of homosexuality. And some of you may have read that bonobo females engage in what is called GG rubbing. It is what a human would call homosexual. They have a sexual engagement of the genitals, and this is part of the thing that cements their female alliances. Let me suggest that the term homosexual and heterosexual is a total human construct created to, in fact, let us even say there are innate sex differences, because we now have cordoned off one kind of sexuality. There's homosexuality and there's heterosexuality. And anyone who's read Shulamith Firestone from way back in the 70s, this has been discussed previously and now under new terms. This is a human construct that humans are protecting with all their might. San Diego Zoo is apparently run by a very conservative organization, and when Nova, it may have been Nova or Discovery, one of these science channels, I don't remember which one, came in and said, we're doing a documentary about homosexuality in the animal world. And of course, if you wander around the zoo and you just hang out, you are going to see it. And the administration of the zoo said, we don't have any homosexual animals at our zoo, and turned them away.
We will go to questions from the audience, but while you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to ask the panelists who obviously have very different views if they would like to respond to one another briefly before we open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I'd like to make a few comments. 10 minutes doesn't allow you to really give a very nuanced talk. I don't want anybody to think that I said that testosterone increases intelligence in the brain. That's not what I said, what I meant to say. I also want to emphasize that there's a tremendous bell-shaped curve of variation within both men and women. And there's a tremendous overlap at the edges. So when you talk about make sweeping generalizations, you also have to take into consideration there is an enormous variation at the edges of these curves. It's important to remember how universities came into existence. David Noble wrote a very interesting book about cathedral schools. And all the universities, the major universities today, the old European ones, were founded as cathedral schools, as offshoots of the church. And they only allowed males to learn Latin, and at that time, if you didn't know Latin, you couldn't really gain access to the wisdom of the ages, so to speak. So there's a very deep-seated, discriminatory aspect of universities that has passed down through the ages that is what we're trying to overcome today. I'd just like to mention that as a surgeon, surgery is sort of the Marine Corps of the medical specialties. And there was a tradition that there were no women surgeons for a very long period of time. And I trained surgical residents at UCSF, and over 50% of the residents coming through our program now are women. It's very interesting to see there's a difference between the way women approach operations and men approach operations. One side isn't better than the other, it's just different. And again, there's a bell-shaped curve, there's a tremendous variation. I like to think of the sign outside the operating room doors that say, "Do not enter." This is the inner sanctum. And the men, for centuries, dressed up in these funny little outfits with the hats and the masks and huddled over a patient. And the women said, "What are you guys doing in there?" And we said, "It's men's work. You can't come in." And one day they came in and they peered over our shoulder and they said, "Oh, you're sewing." "Oh, well, we know how to sew. Step aside." So as a result, we now have a lot of women surgeons.
So if you have a question, please make it brief and to the point, and no speeches or I'll have to interrupt you. So if you give your question, I will repeat it so everyone can hear it. Do we have questions? In the back?
I just want to know if you know the models that are successfully training women, engineers, scientists, mathematicians. What's the social construct in India or Asia that allows more women to participate?
And are you asking whoever? Okay. The question, if I understand it, is there a social construct to encouraging more women to go into science and engineering? Is that correct? In India and China, okay. Anybody know?
I can't really speak about this with any expertise, but I did just read an article in New York Magazine by an Indian woman journalist who was writing about her parents, her father, trying to make a match for her. She's 32, so over the marriageable age, and the only acceptable professions of her suitors are doctor and engineer, not law, not finance, not anything else. And for her to be one herself, I guess, was not in the cards either, was the implication of this article. I think that, India is a democracy, and they are becoming a huge source of infotech jobs for the world. And many of the Indians are coming to our schools and going back to create companies, to manage companies. I don't have numbers on how the differences between the genders are in that country go. I can say from the program that I've just recently come to direct at MIT, the Sloan Fellows Program, which is a management MBA-style program. We have one Japanese woman from NTT Docomo who is genius, and one Indian woman. There are probably 13 Japanese men and half a dozen other Asians and 4 or 5 Indian men. The balance is certainly skewed. We just don't get the applicants. So that suggests to me that there isn't a construct for putting women in the pipeline yet. But the U.S. probably will lead the world on this issue, and probably as a result of what happened 2 months ago in Harvard Square.
Could I just add something to that? You know, it's interesting that we're so far in our country from a social framework that really rewards women for being good in science and math, that we have to look to India and China, where boys and girls score equally on test scores, and Iceland, where girls score higher. We have to look to foreign countries, but it is right here. And I would suggest, I had no idea until this very moment that Stuyvesant High School, where I went, is in fact a model for this, and it's very, very simple. Just make it really hot and sexy and popular to be good in science and math. Stuyvesant High School was a place where your social status, to some extent, rested on your test scores, and that was for males and females, and it's a very unusual circumstance, but it works wonders.
Just one more quick comment. There's something called the Putnam Fellows, which is it's a competition for extreme mathematicians. These are not just 800 scores on the SATs. They are way out there. And until it's been going about 65 years, and until the early 1990s, never was there a woman winner. But since the last decade or so, there have been several outright winners and team winners who are women, many of them having names we wouldn't think of as Americans. But there are women who are winning this prize now, and that's a good sign.
Someone over here had their hand up. Yeah. Yes.
I was a manager in the early 80s and on through the 90s when I retired in a major industrial corporation. And none of you have addressed the economic pressures that are brought to bear on this team. A manager in 1970 had to choose between a female and a male. He chose the male because the female was the more pregnant. And that was economics. There may have been prejudice involved too, but when you train a guy to be a manager, you put him on. A manager is trained to be a manager. She's not going to be there all the time. So there's an economic issue. What's going on?
Okay, the question is about the economic dimensions of talking about gender discrimination, and that has to do with especially looking at in businesses, if you're hiring a man versus a woman, what kind of prejudice and what's the reality of that? Is that your question?
I'm going to take a shot in the dark. I just want to, it's not my topic, but it seems to me that if you're afraid of hiring a woman because she's going to get pregnant and you're going to lose money, then the idea of being a manager is misunderstood. I know that there's a lot of studies going on right now in the business world trying to figure out how to get women back into the workforce after they've had children, and how to keep them in the workforce while they're having children in terms of changing the work week hours. I don't think it's a question of changing I think it's about looking at how we manage a business, not so much who we hire. And I think the question itself reveals a bit of discrimination.
Yeah, I think that one has to realize that there's a discrimination that is built into our languages. You know, in most of the languages of the world, the nouns have a feminine or a masculine article before them. Think about that for a second. That objects in the world would have a sexual value. So if you're German, French, Spanish, or Italian, you have to learn at a very early age which nouns are feminine and which nouns are masculine. Now, if you do a study of them, you'll find that, in general, the negative nouns, disability, malaise, vacancy, tend to be feminine nouns. And the positive nouns like honor and valor, courage, are masculine nouns. So built into these languages at a very early age, girls are diminished in their self-esteem before they even understand what's happening, just as boys are raised. Now, I think that one of the reasons that the women gained the vote in the United States in the 20s and in England in the 30s, much earlier than the continent, had to do with the fact that there are no gender articles in English. And one of the strengths of America has been, and the English-speaking countries, has been the fact that women have gained a greater sense of equality in these countries than they have in these other countries where the language is built in and has a discriminatory aspect to it. Now, I look at the Muslim world, which has produced, they've done studies on patents, new patents issued, Nobel Prize winners in science. It's astonishing how few they are. I look, I think that to some extent their repression of the women of their society has made them like one of these stroke victims that's paralyzed on one side of their body, hobbling, dragging one side, because by not allowing one half of their population to achieve the potential that they have, that they could have, that they are keeping the societies more backward than they should be. And one of the reasons that we have advanced in this country, even though we still have a long way to go, is that women were allowed to advance at a much faster rate than they did in these other countries.
In all kinds of professions. Just two anecdotes. There, one from Japan. There's a Korean woman in her early 50s who just suffered a reversal in an appeals court of a court case she won in Tokyo. She's a public health official and was angling for a promotion, and she was basically charging sex discrimination. And in the court's ultimate decision to say, no, you can't be promoted, the language, and I'm paraphrasing, but it essentially had something to do with, we're not sure the community would be in a position to receive your treatments and so on, but whether it's, I mean, in that society where I lived and is overcoming the obstacles that we've overcome here in America, you know, over the past few decades, where a woman, a Korean, and an older person, that's like strike three. There was an interesting piece in the New York Times Sunday magazine a few weeks back about an interview with Christine Schutt, who wrote the book Florida, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction, and she's one of 5 female finalists, apparently, and a male critic said, well, I mean, how can we award a book that sold only 100 copies? I think it sold actually a little over 1,000. Not that many, and I don't know about the book. But this guy also went on to say, but you haven't really paid your dues. And her response to that is, well, you know, I've been teaching literature at a girls' private school in Manhattan for 20 years. I'm divorced and I've raised 2 sons, and my first collection of stories, Night Work, is about the fact of having to do my creative stuff around the clock. And to say that that isn't paying your dues is obvious.
You know, I just wanted to, in a sense, answer your question, which is a very important one. He's saying women are going to get pregnant, managers lose money, and that's what a manager thinks about, and we have to realistically accept that. This is a view of work that is located in time and history, and that is the Industrial Revolution, in which the pair bond that we see today of the monogamous couple became extremely important so that you could pluck a couple up as one unit and move them around like little pieces in this system. In an agrarian economy, the question of, whoa, it's really a problem that women get pregnant isn't an issue because life is integrated with the work. So as long as we are in this traditional Industrial Revolution model, and as long as that sticks, that question is always going to come up, and the manager is always going to say, this pregnant woman is a detriment as an FT, a full-time worker, or an FTE, or whatever you call it. And so the feminist call to change the workplace that began in the 1970s with the women's movement is still with us. It is just underground.
Oh, it's so hard not to make comments. Question?
Over here.
There, and then you.
About 2 years ago, I went to a high school graduate.
I will repeat it.
I went to a high school graduation in Evergreen, Colorado. Very big high school, very affluent community. And there were 7 or 8 valedictorians, which meant kids who were 4 points and over. And out of the 7 or 8, there was only one boy who was a valedictorian. And out of all of the honors that they award at the end, only one boy got an honor, the same young man. And I wondered, and I understand that's not unusual, and I'm wondering what you think about that. The over-performance, it seems, of young girls over young boys in high school, and then what happens later.
Hey, she was sharing that at Evergreen High School, and she thinks it may be true in many other high schools, that the top valedictorians were girls, like 7 to 1 or something like that, 7 to 1 boy. And wondering about overachieving and how common this is, or you would like the people to comment on this, the panelists?
Right.
You have a-
This seems to be consistent. I've seen different articles, and I'm wondering why you think that's occurring, and then what shifts.
Oh, okay. That if they are such top achievers in high school, then why aren't women higher in achieving and when they get into either higher education or into professional life?
I think to some extent that girls are more mature than boys are at the same age, and boys mature at a later rate. That may be one factor. The interesting statistic is that 55% of college students today are women, which is a marked reversal of what it was just 20, 30 years ago. And the boys are disappearing from the academic scene in terms of graduation numbers, and that's going to have an impact in the future quite a bit.
We have time only for one more question. Yes, sir.
I want to make 2 quick comments. The first is, gauche, as a left-handed male, I would point out gauche and sinister also have very negative connotations. Second, a study by a female economist suggested strongly that a major factor in lower pay for females is they tend to be located where their husband has the best employment opportunity. But then, to Mr. Clifford, there's no explanation in innate difference for what you're talking about. Well, suppose you go back one step. Is there a possible innate difference in men deriving from the hunting group? And it just makes it more difficult for men to select a female to be in their professional work group. Something, I would say, socially, is another challenge to overcome.
Did you get the question? Okay, make it a brief answer because we are nearing the end here and I'm going to have to cut it off. Will you repeat the question as you give the answer?
There were two questions.
Yes.
And one was about the language we use. Well, there was a point about the language we use, and lefties, sinister, gauche, has obvious connotation that's not as great as might is right. And whether in innate differences, we hunter males make selections, certain selections about the women we work with, if I understood you correctly. I can say that also you mentioned something about females locating to where their husband's employment is. I moved back from Japan in 2002 because my wife got a much higher paying job than I would ever see in journalism at State Street Bank in Boston, and I decided to take off some time to get to know my kids since I've been gallivanting all around Asia, writing stories and going on television. And it was a time to get to know my kids. And I found that it was very difficult in some way for me to fit in at the elementary school in the various activities that mothers take part in. They didn't know what to make of me, and I certainly had not been in their company in that way before, but I got to be involved and more or less accepted. Where I found the greatest difficulty actually was with my wife and her parents, who, although the idea was acceptable to try an unorthodox work-life style, at least as far as it affected my own circumstances, the security that she felt being the breadwinner, and I also suspect the fact that she was with bankers wearing silk ties and cufflinks and came home to a husband in a sweatshirt and cut-off jeans, kind of made her feel a little uneasy over time. And I had my own sort of selection going on, like I missed the pace of work, and as much as I enjoyed being a parent to my very active parent, I found the network and the satisfaction and the ego blast that comes from working professionally to be a big miss. So for two reasons, I decided to get back in the workforce. Now, I think it was probably a lot easier for me to do that than it would be the other way around. And we haven't really talked about women after childbirth. I mean, that's unfortunately a topic we haven't addressed. And I'm kind of out of time to answer your other question about the genetics, but I have thoughts we can talk afterwards.
Let me just make one announcement. Tapes of this panel will be available for $5 approximately half an hour after the end of this panel in room 245 from Tapes Again. CDs and DVDs are also available to be ordered for most panels, but due to processing time, will be made available for delivery or pickup after the conference. I want to thank the panelists and thank you for being here. I think we've had a good discussion.
Anybody who would like to sign the SpongeBob underpants and send them to Dr. James Dodson of the Free for Family Coalition.
Yeah.